Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at the lecture concerning topic peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is composed of mainly neurons, which are the most important cells conveying the information as an electrical signal. And we have four types of neurons overall throughout the whole nervous system, so both peripheral and central. And some of these neurons are also part of the peripheral nervous system. So generally, the most common type of neurons are multipolar, which means that there are more than two processes, one axon and more dendrites. Then we have bipolar. Yeah, bi meaning two. So we have two processes only, one axon and one dendrite. These are quite specific, and we find them only concerning the cranial nerves, and it's the first in olfactory mucosa, and second in retina, and the eighth in the inner ear. Then we have unipolar with only one process, and they are quite rare, and we can find them only in retina, like rods and cones. And then we have a special kind, which are called pseudo unipolar, which means that they have one process, as we can see here, one process, which is very short and then divides into two. So we can see here a rotated shape of letter T. And this is here to bypass the pericardium, the soma, the body of the nerve cell, which could slow down the transmission of the signal. Yeah, that's why then the signal bypasses this the nerve cell body, and it's arranged as a T-shaped cell. Yeah? And we find this in somatosensory and visceral sensory ganglia. So this is just to understand when we speak about bipolar or pseudo unipolar ganglia, so we understand which kind of neurons we can find there. Then we can divide the neuron types not according to the shape, but according to the function. So for this, we have three kinds of neurons. And in the peripheral nervous system, the motor and sensory are the most important. In central nervous system, it's mainly interneurons, which interconnect other neurons and also the neurons with motor and sensory function. So the motor neurons, or sometimes called motoneurons, are the neurons which are responsible for movements. So then their axons, they run out of CNS, so we call them efferent or centrifugal. So their axons come from CNS to periphery, to the effector organs. And the effector organs can be skeletal muscles, and we call them somatomotor, or the other kind of muscle, that means smooth and cardiac muscle, and we call them visceral motor. Visceral motor means it supplies the muscles which we are not able to govern by our will, so involuntary muscles, plus glands, all exocrine and some endocrine glands as well. The somatomotor to skeletal muscles are these which we are able to control by our will, so voluntary muscles. Opposite direction concerns the sensory neurons. So they are afferent or centripetal, so running from periphery, from receptors to CNS. So which receptors are these? These receptors can be in the skin. So they perceive from outer surrounding, which we call then exteroception. And these we call somatosensory sensory, as they come from the surface of the body. On the contrary, from inside, interoception, so from organs inside, we call it visceral sensory. And then we have some special kind. If it comes from muscles, the muscle tendons and joint capsules, we call it proprioception. So it gives us information about the position and tension of the muscles and joints. And then we have special senses, so not touch and proprioception and pain, but very special senses, vision in eye, and hearing and balance in the ear, and taste in tongue, and smell in nose. So these are special sensory. Yeah, so this is just to understand when we talk about the function of the neurons, how we can divide them. And here we can see how morphologically these neurons differ. In the lower part of the figure, we can see the somatomotor neuron. Somatomotor neuron is the easiest arrangement, as we can see the cell body and an axon. And you can see that between the cell body, axon, and the effector organ, which is at the neuromuscular plate, at the end we find the muscle fibers. There is no interruption. And we can see this myelin sheath is with the Ranvier's nodes in between. On the contrary, if you look here, up, and that was the motor neuron. If you look up at the sensory neuron, what we can see here? We can see that the cell body is not located in the spinal cord. We can imagine that here we have a spinal cord, or in case of cranial nerve, it will be the brain stem. So brain stem or spinal cord. We can see that the cell body is outside. So the cell body is outside, and if we have cell bodies outside of the CNS, we call it a ganglion. So here's a ganglion, and this is the typical T-shaped cell. So this is pseudo unipolar neuron. And this is a dendrite, and this is an axon. But in case that the axon and dendrite they are continuous, we usually prefer to call them peripheral process and a central process. And the term dendrite and axon usually do not use for that, as these are they are not a separate processes of the nerve cell body, and they form one long process. That's why we better call it a peripheral and central process. So we have talked about the somatomotor and somatosensory. So again here, the somatomotor, it starts with the alpha motor neurons here and runs directly to the muscle. No ganglion. But if we look at the somatosensory, here we can see the ganglion with the pseudo unipolar neuron, T neurons, and the peripheral process and the central process, and then it goes into the CNS here, into the spinal cord. So this is somatosensory from skin, and this was somatomotor to the muscles. And of course, then we have the visceral sensory and the visceral motor. So if you look at the visceral motor, that means the fibers which which assist in the movement of the heart and smooth muscles and glands. So you can see that they are also synapsed. So they have here a ganglion, and they are synapsed here. So we have a pre-synaptic neuron or fiber and post-synaptic, or we can call them pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic fibers. How they differ? Of course, they differ by the position, and they also differ by the myelin sheaths. That the preganglionic are myelinized, and the postganglionic are not myelinized, so they are unmyelinated. The postganglionic. What about visceral sensory? So visceral sensory, for example, from the heart, it goes the same way as the somatosensory. So it's also synapsed here in the spinal ganglion. So somatosensory and visceral sensory has got similar arrangement. So if you look at it generally, where we do not have ganglia, only in somatomotor fibers, there are no ganglia. Yeah? Somatomotor fibers, no ganglia. All the other fibers has got a ganglion. The somatosensory and visceral sensory in the spinal ganglion in case of spinal nerves. For visceral motor, that means sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, we find the ganglion in different locations. So these are general terms which we will use. And of course, nerves are structures which has to be covered by connective tissue, and it's similar to muscles. So we have three different positions of the connective tissue concerning their names. So we have endoneurium, which is the thinnest layer, and it divides the myelinated and non-myelinated fibers from each other. Yeah, so the endoneurium is between the nerve fibers. Then we have perineurium. The perineurium covers the fascicles of the nerve fibers. And then we have epineurium, and epi means above, so epineurium covers the whole nerve. Yeah? The whole nerve also contains the vasa nervorum, so the vessels of the nerve. And then in diseases in which small vessels suffer, for example, diabetes, hypertension, atherosclerosis, then the nerves suffer as well, and the patient can suffer from problems of the ischemia of the nerves. So here, again on the section, you can see the epineurium surrounding the nerve, the perineurium surrounding the fascicles and filling the spaces in between the fascicles, and endoneurium, and the endoneurium covers the nerve fibers themselves. And of course, the nerve fiber is covered usually by a sheaths, either myelin sheath or sheaths of the Schwann cells. As for the development, you have talked about this in a separate part, but it is necessary to remind you of the stage which is called neural tube. And next to the neural tube, of course, we have neural crest, and from the cells of neural crest, the PNS is formed, especially the ganglia. And then when we look at the neural tube, for us it's very important how the neural tube is generally arranged. And we can see the section of the neural tube. In the middle, we find here the sulcus limitans, and the sulcus limitans divide the neural tube into two parts, the ventral part and the dorsal part. The ventral part is called basal, yeah, so this we find ventrally, or basally. The dorsal part we call alar plate and basal plate. Why alar? You can see this. And this is a neural tube which then opens in this way in the extent of the brain stem, mainly medulla oblongata and pons. So you can see that what was dorsally then gets laterally. And that's then important for the cranial nerves development and their function. In spinal cord, it still keeps this arrangement. But it's important for us that what is in the basal plate, so what is basally, is motor. And it's somatomotor, what is the most ventral, so the most basal part. And visceral motor is the part which is close to the midline. Then, on the contrary, close to the midline, dorsally in the alar plate, these are visceral sensory fibers, and these which are most dorsally are somatosensory fibers. That means information from the skin comes here, dorsally. Information from the organs come here, dorsally, close to the midline. Information for movement of smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands comes from ventrally, close to the midline, and information to the skeletal muscle comes from what is the most ventral area. Yeah, so that's why then the final arrangement of the sensory and motor and autonomic neurons is similar to this neural tube. Okay, so that was just a part of the embryology which is important for function. And to conclude, we should define the term, or we should talk about the afferent fibers. And what we already know that the afferent fibers begins at receptors, and these receptors can be exteroceptors, that means they are in skin, somatosensory, or in other special senses. So that's the vision, hearing, balance, smell, and taste. They can be in organs, so interoceptors, so visceral sensory, and proprioceptors, which are in muscles, tendons, and articular capsules. So they run from receptors to the central nervous system, so to the spinal cord or brainstem. So they are always synapsed in ganglion, which we call either spinal or cranial ganglion. And they enter the posterior spinal horn, or they enter brainstem. And the information has to ascend as far as cortex and has some collaterals to cerebellum and reticular formation, so they form so-called ascending tracks in CNS. We'll come to these later. Afferent fibers, they originate ventrally, so in anterior spinal horns, or of course in brainstem or the cranial nerves. In case they are visceral motor, they originate in lateral spinal horns, as I show you on the section of the spinal cord in some minutes. So the somatomotor ones, they supply the striated muscles. And when they supply the striated muscles, they care for voluntary movements, or we can call them conscious movements. They form motor units, and motor units is a group of muscle fibers supplied by one nerve fiber. They supply both the muscles and neuromuscular bundles, neuromuscular spindles. So what is a neuromuscular spindle? Neuromuscular spindle is a receptor, a proprioceptor inside the muscle. How it looks like? It looks like a spindle. So it's spindle-shaped structure inside the muscle. So you can imagine a big muscle. This big muscle contains muscle fibers, and we call these muscle fibers extrafusal, as they are outside the muscle spindles. Then we have small muscle spindles, and the muscle spindles contain also muscle fibers, but they are quite short and thinner. And we call them intrafusal fibers. So these receptors then receive fibers from so-called gamma motor neurons, and the extrafusal, that means all the muscle fibers of the muscle, receives information from so-called alpha motor neurons. These alpha and gamma motor neurons are found in the same areas of the anterior spinal horn. They are close to each other. So the muscle spindles are receptors, and if you would like to perform a movement, what you need for performing that movement, you need to prepare the muscle in the right tone and tension. So for that, you first prepare these receptors, and then you can move the muscles, and according to the change of shape and tension of these intrafusal fibers, from these intrafusal fibers, of course, runs inside back some proprioceptive fibers, which tells us how the muscle is stretched. So when I have my hand elevated like this above my head, how now I can imagine the position? Either I can look at it with my eyes, or I have to feel it. And I feel it according to the tension of these muscle spindles and, of course, Golgi tendon organs in tendons. Yeah, so this means when we talk about the extrafusal muscle fibers, these are the normal muscle fibers, and then intrafusal are short, small, inside muscle spindles. So both these somatomotor fibers coming from alpha and gamma motor neurons, they have no ganglia, as we have talked about that, so they run directly to the neuromuscular plate. On the contrary, visceral motor, which serves for involuntary or unconscious movements, they are synapsed in ganglion, which we call autonomic ganglion. So they run together with some cranial nerves, and it is necessary to learn which one. So the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. And they follow the trunk of the spinal nerve. And then they leave it to the autonomic ganglion, and then they come back from the autonomic ganglion to the spinal nerve as well. And this we call a white and a gray communicating branch. We will come to this in a minute, but you will understand that first we have the white branch as it's preganglionic, so myelinated, and then we have the gray branch as it's non-myelinated postganglionic. Myelin is white, so the nerve with the myelin sheath is whiter than the gray postganglionic unmyelinated fiber. So this is just general. And of course, do not forget that when we have a group of neuron cell bodies, nerve cell bodies, pericardia, we call it nucleus when it's inside CNS. When it's outside CNS, we call it ganglion. So here we have the ganglia, and you can see the types of the ganglia here. So we have either sensory ganglion, or we can have autonomy ganglion. So the sensory ganglion can be somatosensory or visceral sensory with pseudo unipolar neuron. So that's the spinal, and then other cranial nerves, or it can be the special sensory, and the special sensory is usually bipolar. And the special sensory we are not going to talk about now. We leave it to the special cranial nerves. The first one of olfactory, where we have the bipolar neurons, but the ganglia, special ganglia for special sensory nerves are only at the vestibulocochlear nerve, so the 8th cranial nerve. The autonomic ganglia we can divide according to the functional system into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And what is the difference? The difference is in the location and composition. Sympathetic ganglia are located within the sympathetic trunk, or they can be located in aortic abdominal plexus, so around abdominal aorta, and we call them celiac, mesenteric, and aorticorenal ones. Yeah, we'll come to this in detail in autonomic system. So sympathetic are closer to the center. Parasympathetic are more distant, and we know the parasympathetic ganglia already from the skull. So we have the ciliary ganglion in orbit, pterygopalatine within the pterygopalatine fossa, otic in infratemporal fossa, and submandibular in submandibular triangle. We will come to these again then in autonomic system. This is just to inform you that we have more types of ganglia. So the somatosensory ganglia are spinal ganglia, which we are going to talk about today. They are located at the posterior root of the spinal nerve. Ganglia of cranial nerves, which is, I'm sorry, not number 3, of course, but number 5. This is wrong. Here has to be number 5. So trigeminal ganglion, geniculate ganglion, and superior inferior ganglion of glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. So these 4. And altogether, the spinal ganglia and the ganglia of cranial nerves, they contain the T cells. The glutamate is the neurotransmitter, and fibers here do not synapse. These ganglia only contain nerve cell bodies forming these pseudo unipolar neurons, with the peripheral and central process. So that's a somatosensory ganglion. Then we have to talk about the autonomy ganglion, which can be sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I said that the sympathetic we find close to the center, so they are either paravertebral in sympathetic trunk or prevertebral in aortic abdominal plexus, so plexus aorticus abdominalis. This is just general information. The parasympathetic are for cranial, we have talked about that, ciliary, pterygopalatine, submandibular, and otic. That's for the head. And then for the organs, they are located within the wall of the organs. So usually do not see them by naked eye. They are located inside the muscle layer of the organs. So we call them intramural ganglia. So the autonomic ganglia contain multipolar neurons. They are efferent. As a neurotransmitter, they use two different substances. Is acetylcholine in parasympathetic system and noradrenaline in sympathetic system. And when you see how the ganglia looks like, they contain synapse, as they are multipolar neurons here. So they contain synapse. And you can see another difference. A sympathetic ganglion contains the visceral motor fiber, sympathetic visceral motor fiber, and visceral sensory fiber. If you look here to the parasympathetic ganglion, it contains parasympathetic visceral motor fiber, and it of course contains some sensory. In this case is somatosensory fiber for the cranial one, and visceral sensory for the pelvic part, as we will talk about parasympathetic system being a craniosacral system. But it also contains the sympathetic visceral motor fiber, which is not synapsed. As you can see, it just passes through. That's why it's called parasympathetic ganglion. It's called according to the system which is synapsed in the ganglion. So you just go through this part of the PNS very, very superficially, and then when you understand branching and function of the cranial nerves, peripheral nerves, and autonomic system, you come back here, and then you will understand all what is told here. But still, we need to define the terms. And then we have the special sensory ganglia, as I said, only in vestibulocochlear nerve. So we have the cochlear and the vestibular one, and they contain bipolar neurons. So when they contain bipolar neurons, they do synapse. So just to review which terms we will use now. So we come to the term somatomotor, which comes through skeletal muscle, no ganglia, voluntary movements. Then we have visceral motor, which comes to non-striated, that means cardiac and smooth muscles. It comes to glands. Don't forget that smooth muscles are, of course, in blood vessels. They are synapsed. Preganglionic fibers, myelinized, white, postganglionic fibers, non-myelinized, gray. Opposite direction, somatosensory fibers from receptors in skin and of course in muscles. So that's from skin it's touch and pain, and from muscles we call it proprioception. And of course there can be touch and pain, especially pain from the muscles. So the somatosensory, they have ganglia with pseudo unipolar neurons. Then we have the visceral sensory, so the same coming from the organs and the heart and vessels as well. And of course, do not forget the special sensory from special sensory organs. And so one nerve can contain nearly all these kind of fibers. Yeah, the most complex of the nerve is the vagus nerve, which contains all these fibers, except sympathetic, which are subgroup of visceral motor, but it contains parasympathetic fibers. So vagus nerve is example of the nerve containing all the fibers. So then we have to understand in details from which organs or to which organ the fibers run, and to which part of the brain stem and to which nucleus. So this is important to understand these terms in general. Now we can proceed to the peripheral nervous system itself. It is composed from the 12 cranial nerves, which is not the topic of today, and of the spinal nerves. We are going to talk about that, and then from the autonomic system. It used to be called also vegetative system, but this term we consider obsolete, and we prefer the term autonomic system, which is composed of sympathetic part, parasympathetic part, and of course the third part is the enteric system, which you already know from the GIT as the submucous and the myenteric plexuses. So let's talk about the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves lead the spinal cord. The spinal cord develops inside the vertebral canal, so it develops together with the vertebral column and the adjacent muscles. The skin, the muscles, and the vertebral column are derived from somites. And the somites has got a segmentation arrangement. So this segmentation or segmental arrangement is of course present in spinal cord as well. As you can see from this figure, the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column as it grows more slowly. And in adults, it terminates at the intervertebral disc L1, L2. So that's very important for us, that the nerves, the spinal nerves, still leaves the vertebral column at the appropriate level based on the development. But not the spinal cord itself. The segments are moved cranially. They are moved cranially. Where is which segment located directly? We will talk about this later in spinal cord. Just now, remember, from L1, within the vertebral canal, we find only spinal nerves, and we call this bundle of spinal nerves coda equina, the tail of horse. And if we look into the opened vertebral canal from dorsally, we can see the spinal cord terminating here, and then the spinal nerves leaving the spinal cord, and you can see that each spinal nerve contains its ganglion. Yeah. Okay, how many spinal nerves do we have? So in some parts, it's similar to the number of vertebrae. So 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral. Why we have 8 cervical? The first cervical emerges here between atlas and occipital bone, the skull. And the nerve which is here, number 12, so the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve, it is a nerve which is quite similar to the spinal nerves, and it's supplied occipital somites. The occipital somites are not used anymore for the muscles of the trunk, and they moved ventrally, and finally they form the tongue, the muscles of the tongue. So we can see that the hypoglossal nerve and even one part of the accessory nerve, the spinal root, they are somite nerves. So what has happened that these somite nerves got into the skull and their function a bit changed, so the muscles do not possess anymore the segmental arrangement. But the counting of the nerves is based on what we see on the human, and we see that the first nerve emerging from the vertebral column is C1 between skull and atlas. That's why we have C8 between the 7th cervical and 1st thoracic vertebra. And then coccygeal nerve is only one, small one here, as the coccyx is a rudimentary bone. All of these exit via intervertebral foramen. Within the sacral bone, we have branching of the spinal nerve inside the bone into anterior and posterior branch. So what we then see emerging from the vertebral column is already anterior and posterior branch of the 1st to 4th sacral nerve via the anterior and posterior sacral foramina, respectively. The 5th one, together with the coccygeal one, they leave the spinal cord caudally via the sacral hiatus. So this is the mathematics behind that. And do not forget that already from fish, even from sharks, we have the division of the muscles into the epaxial and hypaxial, and it means that all epaxial muscles, which now form only the small group of the deep back muscles, they are supplied by posterior branches. The hypaxial muscles are supplied by anterior branches of the spinal nerves. Yeah, so do not forget this arrangement, and they are divided in humans by the middle layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. So now we come to the branching of the spinal nerve itself. So before we come to the scheme showing the spinal nerve leaving one segment, then better look here. Here we can see part of the spinal cord, and we can see how the nerves leave the spinal cord. They leave it as a bunch of rootlets. Yeah, these are rootlets, in Latin radiculae, and these rootlets leave the spinal cord in two grooves. One groove we can see here, we call it anterolateral, and the other groove is dorsally. Here is the posterolateral groove. So these rootlets then form roots. Yeah, as you can see also here. So the rootlets then form one root, and we have anterior root coming from the anterolateral groove and the posterior root coming from the posterolateral groove. And these two roots then unite into one spinal nerve. And you can see a ganglion, and the ganglion is part of the posterior root. And in the ganglion we find the T-shaped cells, the pseudo unipolar neurons. Spinal segment is a part of the spinal cord which sends rootlets into one spinal nerve. So that's the spinal segment. So now we perform a section through the spinal cord, and we can see here on this model that we have centrally located gray matter. Yeah, that's the gray matter. Means mainly nuclei, and around we find the white matter. So mainly axons and dendrites. On the section, we do not call these structures anymore columns, as we can see here, but we call them horns. Yeah, so now when we have this figure, we can see the gray matter forms horns, and the white matter forms still called so-called funiculi. As for the horns, we call them very easily a posterior horn, an anterior horn, and a lateral horn. And if you remember, during the development, we had the sulcus limitans, which divided us the neural tube into dorsally located alar plate and ventrally located basal plate. And this still remains here, so we can see that the anterior horn will be motor, and it's the most ventral part, so somatomotor. On the contrary, posterior horn is the most dorsal part, so it will be somatosensory, and the lateral horn will be autonomic, both visceral motor and visceral sensory. So here we can see again what we already know, that the rootlets form two roots, anterior root and posterior root, and now we understand that the anterior root will be motor, and the posterior root will be sensory. And as it's sensory, we also find here the ganglion. Then we come to the spinal nerve itself. The spinal nerve is very short. The trunk of the spinal nerve is very short. And here we are in the area of intervertebral foramen. So foramen intervertebrale is located here. And then the nerve branches into some branches. You can see the most important anterior and posterior, anterior for hypaxial and posterior for epaxial muscles. That's why the posterior one is usually thinner. It's not visible much here. And then we have some connections to sympathetic trunk. So this is general arrangement. Now we can move to the branches of the spinal nerve, and we can draw all the fibers which run in. So we have the anterior and we have the posterior branch. As we said, posterior branch for epaxial muscles, anterior branch for hypaxial muscles. The anterior branch form plexuses, and we know you know already brachial plexus and lumbosacral plexus. Then we have another branches. One for meninges, a very thin branch for meninges, as meninges covers of the brain from connective tissue. So the connective tissue contains some receptors, so we have sensory fibers. And it also contains vessels with smooth muscle. So visceral motor fibers. So that's why we have a meningeal branch in each segment. And then we have two communicating branches. These communicating branches connect the spinal nerve and sympathetic trunk. And we have white and gray. And we already know that the white contains myelin, so it has to be preganglionic, and the gray does not contain myelin, so it's postganglionic. So let's look at the figure how it looks like, where all the branches are. And do not forget that the white communicating branch is present only in the thoracolumbar part, only in the area where the sympathetic fibers leaves the spinal cord, and that's the level from C8 to L3. Yeah, details about that will come in the autonomic system. So now, please just remember this extent. Okay, how the nerves looks like. When we come here, we can see the branches. So the anterior branch, better this color. The anterior branch into hypaxial muscles. Posterior branch to epaxial muscles, deep back muscles, as we can see here. And the posterior branch divides into lateral and medial. And the medial gives a cutaneous branch. which is important for us, as the posterior branches supplies not only deep back muscles but also skin in the extent of the deep back muscles. Then what is not drawn here is the meningeal branch. So here should be also somewhere a meningeal branch, but it's usually not drawn in the figures. And then we have the white and gray communicating branches, which connects the spinal nerve to sympathetic trunk. Sympathetic trunk is all the time located on the lateral side of the vertebrae or on the anterior aspect of the sacral bone, respectively. You can see that it's the most dorsal structure, as it's located dorsally to azygos and hemiazygos vein and dorsally to aorta, as we can see here. So now we know that there are 5 branches and what these 5 branches contain. So here we have a scheme of the spinal nerve, and when we talk about the spinal nerve, for example, at the exam, and you would like to explain anything, it would be fine if you are able to draw such a drawing like this. Okay. So let's start with first to talk about the general terms. So posterior, lateral, and anterior horn are the parts of the gray matter of the spinal cord on the section. Yeah? And do not again forget that what is basally is motor, what is dorsally is sensory, so part of the alar plate. Then we have the white matter, and we have anterior, lateral, and posterior funiculi. So that's the white matter, which contains ascending and descending tracts. And then finally, we leave the spinal cord and we have roots. So we have the posterior root and anterior root. Anterior, posterior root. Anterior is motor, posterior is sensory. Then we go through the intervertebral foramen and we come to the very short trunk of the spinal nerve. The trunk terminates bifurcating into the posterior and anterior branch. And here you can see that the posterior branch is really thinner than the anterior one. And the trunk gives the 3 smaller branches, which is the meningeal branch, the white communicating, and the gray communicating branch, or ramus. This is 2D figure. In the reality, it is not so flat, but it is curved, and it is in an oblique plane. So the position of the branching of the white and gray communicating branch is not always like this. Yeah. In reality, if you look at them, they will superimpose, they overlay each other. Yeah? So you can draw them either from this or from the other aspect. So in some books, you can find that the first branch drawn is not the white one, but is the gray one. Yeah? So these two can be exchanged. It's not a mistake. It depends if you look more from medially or from laterally. But in any case, this is a flat 2-dimensional structure. So you have to draw it one on each other. If not, you have to make a mistake from I cannot find the right word for that, but you have to make a scheme which is not real. You need to decide if you put the structure which is ventrally to the left or to the right. Yeah? So this can be found in different books, different position, but it does not mean a mistake. It just means that these structures are one behind the other. Okay, so these are structures, and the last structure is sympathetic trunk. And you can see how the fibers are attached to sympathetic trunk. Sympathetic trunk contains from ganglia, interganglionic fibers, and then branches which runs into organs which we call splanchnic nerves. Yeah, splanchnic nerves. Okay, so these are the parts, and now the content. So first we start here. Alpha motoneurons, and of course gamma motoneurons. Yeah, don't forget alpha motoneurons for extrafusal fibers of the muscles, gamma motoneurons for muscle spindles. So they start in the anterior horn, and their axons run via the nerve into the posterior and anterior branches to supply the muscles. Very easy, no ganglion, nothing special. Then, from the skin of the corresponding area, so there should be some receptors, and from the receptor, the peripheral processes or the dendrites, peripheral processes, they converge, they have the T-shaped pseudo unipolar neurons, so their bodies in spinal ganglion, and finally they enter the posterior horn and they are synapsed here, and then they continue as tracts to upper levels of CNS. So you can see these coming from the posterior and anterior rami, but you can see also the visceral sensory fibers from the organs, yeah, and from meninges. Just telling you about the interoceptors from the organs, and they run the same way. So they are again synapsed in spinal ganglion, and they terminate in posterior spinal horn. So this arrangement is also similar. The most complicated is the visceral motor. The visceral motor fibers, that means sympathetic or parasympathetic, depending on the level. So now you can remember that sympathetic fibers leave from the level of C8 to level of L3. So these are sympathetic. Parasympathetic, which are cranial, sacral system, they live in cranial nerves, which is the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. And then from the spinal cord, they live at the level of S2 to level of S4. You know that the gut is supplied by vagus nerve, yeah, the foregut and midgut, and the border is at the left coccygeal flexure, and the hindgut is supplied by inferior hypogastric plexus, which is derived from S2 to S4. So in these levels, we find these branches, right? In the other levels, they are not present here, these preganglionic branches. So you can see it's a visceral motor, so it runs via the anterior root, then to the trunk of the spinal nerve, and it leaves the spinal nerve via the wide communicating branch as its preganglionic myelinated fiber. And then, in this scheme, it's quite easy, as it's drawn that it's synapsed here. But in reality, it's complicated. There are more of these fibers. Yeah, I do not draw them here, but some of these fibers continues and they synapsed in other ganglia. And I have said that we have the ganglia in abdominal aortic plexus. So plexus aorticus abdominalis, that means the cilia ganglion, superior inferior mesenteric, or aorticorenal ganglia. Or we call this ganglia prevertebral, as they are in front of the vertebral column. Unlike the sympathetic trunk, which is as I showed you, on the sides of vertebral bodies, so we call them paravertebral, next to. Yeah, so these are paravertebral, these are prevertebral. And from these, it goes via plexuses, as the sympathetic system runs as a plexuses around vessels. So we call them celiac plexus, superior inferior mesenteric plexus, renal plexus, and so on. Or they can go down and synapse here, yeah, at the level below, or they can go up and synapse here, up. A sympathetic system leaves the CNS at the level of C8 to L3. How we can get sympathetic fibers into the eye? We know that in eye we have the pupil, and it contracts or relaxes and widens. The sympathetic system, it widens the pupil, so you get more light into the eye. Yeah? If someone is sympathetic to you, your eyes are larger. But how you get the sympathetic system from your brain into the eye? It goes down to spinal cord at the level of C8, and out to sympathetic trunk, and back to so-called superior cervical ganglion. Here it's synapsed, and then it goes via internal carotid plexus and ophthalmic plexus into your eye, and to the ciliary ganglion and to the eye. So please remember that here it's a complication, that the visceral motor fibers comes to sympathetic trunk, and they have 4 possibilities. Either they synapse and continue as the postganglionic fiber, or they go up or down and then they synapse, or they leave the sympathetic trunk via the splanchnic nerves and they come to the other line of the ganglia, to the prevertebral ganglia, where they synapse. Yeah? So they will definitely synapse, but they can do this in different areas. Why it's so complex? The autonomic system is a bit slower than the somatomotor system. Yeah, if you have any reflex, it's quite quick. If you do a movement, it's quite quick. But if you need to react, for example, if you have fear from something, yeah, you are scared, so something happens, you shake, but then you feel how the warm is moving through your body. Yeah, that means the autonomic system start to work, but the reaction is diffuse. Yeah? It's much diffuser than the muscles, but it's slower. And the slowing and the diffuse reaction is done by branching, as you can see here, to different areas, and mainly by synapsing and then traveling in the postganglionic non-myelinated fibers, which are slow. And one of the synapsed postganglionic fibers, I changed the color, then goes back to the spinal nerve and then to the glands and vessels of the skin, dorsally or ventrally. Okay, so now I hope you understand this complex arrangement. When you see that these fibers, for example, the posterior branch, that it goes to supply the back muscles. If you have a nerve which supplies a muscle, so you would expect, okay, I have a muscle and I have a nerve, and the nerve supplies only the muscle. So the nerve you would consider as a pure somatosensory. So you have a pure somatomotor nerve. To give an example of a pure somatosensory motor nerve, you would say, okay, it can be, for example, what you could know, the trochlear nerve, and the trochlear nerve supplies only one muscle, and that's the superior oblique muscle of the eyeball. So you would expect it contains only from alpha motor neuron, it contains the somatomotor fiber. That's true. But it also contains from the muscle spindle. So if you imagine that every muscle has got the muscle spindle. So for muscle spindle, there has to be the proprioceptive fiber, which goes back. So it contains proprioceptive fiber also. It contains the somatomotor fiber. But it contains also the visceral motor fiber, yeah, from the ganglion. Why? Every muscle contains vessels, and these vessels, they have to be supplied. So it also contains visceral motor fibers for the vessels. And the vessels, they have also some receptors in their vessels. Imagine you run too much, you suffer from the ischemia, there is too much lactate in the muscles are tired, and you feel the pain in the muscles caused by too much lactate, so there's a higher acidity, and it stimulates the receptors there. So there has to be, of course, not many, but still there are some visceral sensory fibers. So you can see that such nerve contains 4 kinds of fibers. Yeah, somatomotor, to move the muscle. They are the most important. But of course, it also contains quite a lot of the proprioceptive fibers, and they can form more than half of the content of the nerve. Yeah, it is very important to understand how the muscle is. What is the tension of the muscle? What is the muscle tone? So to understand the real tension of the muscle and the position of the muscle, and then you need to supply the blood vessels, and you need to take information from the receptors. But still, such nerve, which is complex, we call pure somatomotor. Why we call it pure somatomotor? As from the point of neurologist, when the nerve is harmed, when we cut the nerve here, practically the only symptom you can see is the paralysis, is the palsy of the nerve. So the nerve does not work and the muscle cannot contract. And that's it. So please, if we talk about the pure somatomotor nerve, do not forget it all the time contains mainly the proprioceptive fibers from muscle spindles, but of course a visceral motor and visceral sensory for vessels. Okay, and understanding of these fibers is important for our understanding of the reflex arc. Here we have the easiest reflex, which we call a jerk reflex. And for every reflex, you need 5 components. So first component is the receptor. Then the middle component is the CNS center. And then the last component is the effector. Okay, so if we see here the most famous example, which is the patellar jerk reflex. So what do? You tap with the hammer onto the tendon, the patellar tendon on the quadriceps femoris muscle. what you do, you passively extend the muscle. When you passively extend the muscle spindles are activated. So that's the receptor, muscle spindle. That's the receptor. Then you need to get the information into the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord, and the segment L4 is this segment. So it runs via the peripheral and central processes of the pseudo unipolar neuron. So the proprioceptive fiber runs into the spinal cord. They enter the dorsal horns, they pass into the anterior horns, where we have the synapse. So the synapse is between the central process of the afferent lip of the pseudo unipolar neuron in spinal ganglion. So this is the ganglion spinale. And then it terminates on the alpha motor neuron. So the alpha motor neuron is then, or better like this, the alpha motor neuron is then the afferent limb. And the axon of the alpha motor neuron then runs to the same muscle, and it causes contraction of the extrafusal fibers of the striated muscle. So again, receptor, muscle spindle, afferent limb, proprioceptive fibers, and the synapse is between the pseudo unipolar neuron of spinal ganglion and the alpha motor neuron in anterior spinal horn. Then the axon of the alpha motor neuron is the afferent limb, and then the effector are the extrafusal fibers of the quadriceps. Yeah? Very easy reflex. And this reflex, what does it test? It tests if the muscle is okay, if the afferent and efferent nerve fibers within the peripheral nerves, and in this case is the femoral nerve. So if the femoral nerve is okay, and of course if the corresponding segment of the spinal cord is okay. In this case it's L4. Yeah? So this is used in neurology. And of course the reflex can be missing or can be higher or reduced. When it's higher or reduced, if it's not well managed from a higher levels of CNS. Yeah? One of the functions of CNS is, of course, to keep the reflexes at the level which is appropriate. And if we miss such control from the higher levels, then the reflexes can be exaggerated. So this is typical monosynaptic reflex. Of course, it could not work only like that, as the quadriceps is extensor, so the function will be extension of the leg. But if you would like to extend the leg, you need to relax the flexors of the leg, which are located in the posterior group, and we call them colloquially hamstrings. So what you need is not only to activate quadriceps, but also to inhibit the biceps semimembranosus and semitendinosus muscles. How you do it? We have a collateral here, and the collateral, it's a different color. The collateral activates an interneuron, and this interneuron inhibits the alpha motor neuron for the antagonist muscle. So you can see that the whole reflex is composed of this classical monosynaptic reflex, by activating of the alpha motor neuron of the quadriceps, but via an inhibiting interneuron inhibiting the antagonists. So then this we call monosegmental spinal reflex, but polysynaptic. Polysynaptic means that in between we have an interneuron. So it stays the same. So still we have receptor, afferent lip, we have a center, we have efferent limb and effector, but we have more than two neurons. More than two neurons, so we have this interneuron here. So this is anatomical basis for understanding reflexes. And more about the reflexes will of course come in physiology and neurology. These reflexes serve us for maintaining the muscle spindle function. Okay? Imagine you have a glass or jar and there is a muscle tone. Yeah, you hold something and you have a muscle tone. But if someone pours fluid into the jar, then it's getting heavier and you need to use more strength. So how you get the more strength here? So of course the muscle is elongated, so the muscle spindles are activated, and via these reflexes then the muscles are more activated. And of course what is more activated are agonists and what is inhibited are antagonists. Yeah, so the reflex works here as a feedback and helps to regulate the tone and the length of the muscle. Here you can see the nice figure of the muscle spindle. Yeah, it has a connective capsule and inside very short and thinner muscle fibers, but the composition of the muscle fibers is the same. And of course the gamma motor neurons terminates here, and from the center and from the periphery there are of course some proprioceptive fibers, but we will talk about the muscle spindle in a sensory system then in detail. So now how we manage the movement. So we have already talked about this peripheral part, so about the alpha motor neuron and the efferent limb, so the somatomotor fibers and the muscle. But if I would like to move the muscle, I need to send the information from the brain. So this is just to give you a basic imagination. So we start in telencephalon in brain cortex in area 4, which we find in frontal lobe. And here we have so-called pyramidal cells. And from these pyramidal cells, it descends via the subcortical structures and brain stem to medulla oblongata. And between medulla oblongata and spinal cord, so approximately at the level of C1 spinal nerve, there's a decussation. And it means that the fibers which are on the right side, they decussate to the left side and vice versa. Why it's arranged like that, we truly do not know. And finally, this neuron synapsed on the alpha motor neuron. So the tract from the brain to the muscle consists of two neurons. First order neuron, or sometimes it's called upper motor neuron, is in cortex. And the second order neuron is the alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord in the anterior horn. That's it. Don't forget the decussation at the level of C1. Why we talk about that? When I cut here the peripheral nerve, the muscle does not contract. When I have bleeding here, then the tract does not work and the muscle does not contract. Yes, so there is no movement, which we call paralysis or palsy, and that's similar for both these problems. But it is not so easy, as we have here the reflexes, and the reflexes are managed from above. So now I'll explain you the difference between these two kind of pulses. So when we have the problem in the first order neuron or the upper motor neuron, the cortical motor neuron, that means the neuron coming from the cortex down, what are the main symptoms? The main symptoms are, of course, a lesion of the voluntary motorics. That means paresis. Paresis is another word for palsy or for paralysis. But do not forget when we say paralysis, or in Latin plegia, that means complete. So paralysis means complete muscle test, zero, no movement. If you say paresis, it means incomplete, partial palsy. Yeah? So this has to be distinguished then in neurology. So the muscle test from 0 to 5, so then can be either paresis or paralysis, of course. But why there are elevated reflexes and why there is elevated muscle tone? What we have cut is the pyramidal tract in CNS, or what we have interrupted. But still the reflex works. Yeah? The reflex arc is still present. So still the alpha motor neurons, they are activated, they fire, yeah? The neurons fire. And there is no inhibition coming from reticular formation, no inhibition coming from CNS. So then the patient gets into cramps, into spasms. So the reflexes are higher and the muscle tone is also higher. Even what you can find are pathological pyramidal irritation reflexes. Yeah, you will talk about this later in neurology. So pathological reflexes appear, which you would not expect. There is muscle hypertrophy, of course, if you do not use the muscles, they are in cramp, but they are not used actively. There is a hypertrophy, but not very extensive. Okay, when we look at the figure, we can see such a patient, yeah, with a spastic palsy here. So you can see a flexion position, yeah, or here spastic gait on one side. You can see how the patient is moving. So this is the central or spastic palsy. The peripheral one is called flexed. So we have again a lesion of the voluntary movement, motorics. Yeah, it can be either paresis or paralysis, but on the contrary, there is reduced muscle tones. So there is hypotonia, and they are reduced or even absent reflexes. Why? We have cut in this case the alpha motor neuron, so the second motor neuron, the lower motor neuron, that means the peripheral nerve. So of course, when the peripheral nerve is the fourth segment of the reflex, that means the efferent limb of the reflex, if you cut it, there is no reflex. If there is no reflex, then of course there are no reflexes, there is no muscle tone, and there cannot be the pathological reflexes, of course, and here will be a prominent hypertrophy as there is no innervation coming to the muscle. As we cut usually the nerve, and the peripheral nerves are usually mixed, yeah, radial nerve, even the femoral nerve in this case contains sensory innervation for the anterior aspect of the thigh and the medial aspect of the leg by saphenous nerve. So there are also typical lesions of sensitivity. Yeah? And we can have a mixed palsy, which is quite rare, but still you can meet patients with so-called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and it means that we have the lesion both in the anterior spinal horns, that means in the alpha motor neurons, but also in the pyramidal tract. The survival is quite short, and the most famous personality who suffered from this disease was Stephen Hawking, and he lived exceptionally long with this disease. Okay, when we cut the nerve, are we able to regenerate? In CNS, there is no regeneration possible, but in PNS, yes, but only in case that we suture the nerve back. Of course, if you cut the nerve here, then you cut the cell, and this rest of the cell is dead. This rest of the cell is dead. So what then happens? The axon starts to grow, and it grows in different directions. If we want the nerve to grow the right direction, we need to suture the central part, which is still alive, and the peripheral part to make a scaffold, and then the nerve can easily grow through. The speed is 2 millimeters per day. In case we do not do it, then the nerve fibers form such a, it's called neuroma, and then it causes severe pain for the patient. This suture, so this scaffold can be done that you really end-to-end connect the nerve, and if it's not possible, you can take a graft, for example, from sural nerve, and then the sural nerve serves as a scaffold for regeneration. The muscle can wait for the nerve to grow back to the muscle only 12 to 18 months, and then it starts to change into fibrous tissue. And it's because the nerve via the axonal transport also feeds the muscle. So the innervation serves not only for movements, but also it contains special trophic factors, and if these trophic factors are absent, then the muscle changes into a connective tissue and cannot regenerate. Okay, that's all for the general information about the spinal nerve branching. Now let's talk about the branches themselves. The difference between posterior and anterior rami of the spinal nerve is obvious. The posterior, they supply the epaxial muscles, the anterior supply the hypaxial muscles. The anterior forms plexuses, major plexuses, cervical, brachial, lumbar, sacral, and a very small coccygeal plexus. The posterior one, they form no plexuses. They have segmental arrangement. These are differences. What is the same? They are both mixed, so they supply muscles and skin. The posterior rami, they supply the deep back muscles and the adjacent skin. Then the anterior rami, they supply the rest of the muscles of the neck, trunk, abdomen, and mainly limbs, and of course the overlying skin. So then for the posterior branches, should we speak about some specific nerves when they have segmental arrangement? In majority, no. They just have a number according to the level where they leave the spinal cord. And as we said, they supply the deep back muscles and the skin is supplied by the medial branch and its cutaneous branch. So do not forget that we have the posterior cutaneous branch from the medial branch of the posterior branch of the spinal nerve. And here the green area shows us the area supplied by these cutaneous nerves and the extent of the muscles below. But we have 5 exceptions. 5 nerves or group of nerves, they possess a specific name. So when we talk about the C1, so then the C1 is pure somatomotor, and it's because it does not contain the anterior root. Yeah? The first cervical spinal nerve has no posterior root. No posterior root means no sensory information. So we have pure somatomotor fibers, and the posterior branch of the first cervical nerve is called suboccipital nerve, and it supplies the four muscles forming the suboccipital triangle, which is lesser and greater posterior rectus capitis muscle and superior inferior obliquus capitis muscle. So they form a suboccipital triangle in this area. In case of C2 and C3, they have their motor branches, for example, from splenius, semispinalis, intertransversari, and so on. But the sensory branch, so what should be the posterior cutaneous branch, it is enlarged and it has got a specific name. At the level of C2, it's called greater occipital nerve, nervus occipitalis major. At the level of C3, it's called tertiary occipital nerve, nervus occipitalis tertius. And we can see how the greater occipital nerve is large. It runs here on the posterior aspect of the skull, and we can see that it supplies quite large area, as high as the interauricular line. Then the tertiary occipital nerve supplies a small area at the nape of the neck only. So you can see the difference between C2 and C3. And then another areas are here in the area of gluteal region. The gluteal region, if you look here, are supplied by three cluneal nerves. And we can see that the inferior part is supplied by inferior cluneal nerves, and they are branching from the posterior, as you can see here, from the posterior cutaneous nerve of the thigh, yeah, or posterior cutaneous femoral nerve. But the middle and superior cluneal nerves, they are branches from the posterior branches of the spinal nerves. So the posterior, superior cluneal and middle cluneal nerves, they are the sensory component of L1 to L3 or S1, S3 respectively, and they supply the area of the gluteal region of the buttocks. The superior cluneal nerves can be compressed here where they pass across iliac crest. So that's clinically important. They can be compressed here. The same is valid for the occipital nerve. So the greater occipital nerve can be entrapped here when passing through the fascia. Similarly, a lesser occipital nerve, which is branched from the cervical plexus, can be also compressed here when passing through the fascia. So the both occipital nerves, or one of them, can be compressed here, and of course we have to solve it usually by nerve block. But don't forget that the minor is branched from plexus cervicalis, but the greater is a branch from the posterior branches of the spinal nerves. And we can nicely find them when passing through the fascia between the trapezius sternocleidomastoid muscle, which are superficially, and the deep back muscles. And we call this occipital neuralgia. So it can be caused by entrapment of either greater or lesser occipital nerve. So that's all for the for the posterior branches of the spinal nerves. And now we should talk about the anterior branch of the spinal nerves. They form plexuses, and the brachial plexus and the lumbar and the sacral plexus are already well known to you as they supply the muscles of the limbs. So we are going to talk about the cervical plexus and the intercostal nerves and a bit about the coccygeal plexus only. So cervical plexus originates from first to fourth cervical spinal nerves. And you can see that very close to that is the hypoglossal nerve, as the hypoglossal nerve is also the somoid nerve, so it also forms morphologically connection with the cervical plexus, but not functionally. Here, this easy scheme shows you that the cervical plexus supplies muscles and the skin, and you can see in this upper part that there is no C1. That means the C1 has no sensory component. Yeah? Sensory component is only in the area of C2, C3 to C4. Then the nerves which leaves here, the sensory component, they leaves behind sternocleidomastoid muscle in omotrapezoid triangle in the area, and this area is called punctum nervosum, and then it supplies the skin area. What about the muscles? The muscles supplied by cervical plexus are a group of muscles. We are going to talk about them in detail. Then diaphragma supplied by phrenic nerve. So let's talk now about the individual nerves. So first, the sensory component from the cervical plexus, so the segments C2 to C4. You can see here that the four nerves of interest emerge in omotrapezoid triangle behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle in this small area of 2 centimeters. This area is called a nerve point of Jonas. It is not a point, it is an area, but Jonas was a Czech physician, and he found out when these nerves are irritated, you can palpate the this point here behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it's painful. Please do not mix this with another point, and it's called point of Herpes, and it's for brachial plexus. This point is located several centimeters below where the brachial plexus emerges from the scalenic fissure. Yeah? So these 2 points, which are sometimes mixed in books, please, you have to distinguish them. And we can see that we have here several nerves. So let's talk about these nerves. So first of them is the lesser occipital nerve. The lesser occipital nerve, when it emerges, it runs along the sternocleidomastoid muscle and then gets behind the auricle and supplies the skin behind the auricle as well as the superior medial surface of the auricle. So that means behind the auricle and the superior aspect. So that's the lesser occipital nerve. Then we have great auricular nerve. Great auricular means it's the largest of these nerves, and it comes to the auricle and then it bifurcates. And it's like a fork, so the anterior branch supplies the lateral aspect and the posterior branch the medial aspect of the auricle and its inferior half. So then we have the anterior and the posterior branch here. The great auricular nerve is also used in clinics for transplant of facial nerve in case we have to remove the parotid gland due to a tumor and the facial nerve is harmed. You can use this great auricular nerve as a transplant or as a graft for the facial nerve to replace it. Then we have the transverse cervical nerve. The transverse cervical nerve runs ventrally across the sternocleidomastoid and divides into two branches, above and below hyoid bone, which we call a superior and inferior branch. And then we have a communication between the superior branch and the facial nerve, which we call ansa cervicalis superficialis, so superficial ansa cervicalis. This is a very superficial, thin communication between the facial nerve and the transverse cervical nerve. And then we have groups of nerves, which we call supraclavicular nerves. And they descend, these supraclavicular nerves, they descend even across and below clavicle, and they supply the skin in the extent of the second to third intercostal space and even on the shoulder. Yeah, so these are medial, intermediate, and lateral supraclavicular nerves. So these are these nerves, these four nerves forms the sensory component of the cervical plexus. So here we can see how they branch and that they supply the area from segment C2, C3, and C4. So here you can see the dermatomes supplied by these nerves. And especially this is a figure which you should know how to draw and understand which areas are supplied by which nerve from the cervical plexus and which areas are supplied by which segment of the spinal cord. So C2, C3, and C4. So you can see that C2 is greater occipital, but C2 is also lesser occipital and part of the great auricular and transverse cervical. C3 is transverse cervical, supraclavicular, great auricular, and here dorsally the third or tertiary occipital nerve as well. And don't forget that the border between these is the interauricular line. Yeah. Then for the auricle, the only part of the auricle which is not supplied by cervical plexus is the superior part of the lateral aspect, which is supplied by auriculotemporal nerve, which is branched from mandibular, and a very small part here in the concha and external acoustic meatus, which is supplied by auricular branch, which is branched from vagus nerve. But this is the matter of the cranial nerves. Do not forget this. And then the border runs not along the margin of the mandible, but here is the anterior branch of great auricular nerve. Then it goes to the tip of mandible, and here also the submental triangle skin is supplied by mylohyoid nerve, and the mylohyoid nerve is branched from mandibular. Yeah, so the innervation from trigeminal nerve and the border with the cervical plexus and posterior rami of the spinal nerves is not running precisely along the mandible. How is it with the motor branches? Here, please check the long list of the muscles. And when we go through the name of the muscles one by one or two by two, you will understand how to remember the muscles. So first, group of very short muscles, and it's anterior and lateral recti muscles of the head. Then two long muscles of the head and neck, longus capitis and longus coli. Don't forget that when we get below the level of C4, then usually the muscles are supplied by branches not from cervical plexus, but branches from the brachial plexus. Sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscle, they are supplied by accessory nerve, but they have an additional fibers coming from C2 to C4. Levator scapula is supplied by dorsalis scapula. Dorsalis scapula is C5, and it has additional fibers from C3 to C4. Then we have scalenus anterior and medius. The posterior is too low, so it's supplied by brachial plexus only. And then intertransversari, which are very, very small muscles. But except for these, we have, as you can see here, these four muscles, which are the infrahyoid muscles. How these muscles are innervated? They are innervated by one of the loops of the cervical plexus, which we call deep cervical ansa, ansa cervicalis profunda. It is formed by inferior root, C2 to C3, and superior root. So this would be only one of the loops of the cervical plexus, but the superior root, as you can see, runs together with the hypoglossal nerve. Here we have the trunk of the hypoglossal nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve receives here a branch from the cervical plexus, and then the branch again diverts and leaves it. It used to be called, this branch, and you can find it even in some books, ramus descendens nervi hypoglossi, so descending branch of the hypoglossal nerve. But we do not use this term anymore. We call it superior root of ansa cervicalis. As this fiber only runs together with the hypoglossal nerve, but in case of palsy of hypoglossal nerve, the infrahyoid muscles are not affected. They would be affected only in case we cut the hypoglossal nerve here. But if the pulse is more centrally, then we have only hemiglossoplagia, but no problems with these infrahyoid muscles. And then there are two small exceptions. That thyroid muscle is very small one, so it's supplied only by fibers directly from C1, not the whole ansa. And the same is geniohyoid muscle, which is also small one. It's the suprahyoid muscle, but it's supplied by C1 coming from cervical plexus. So please remember this arrangement for deep cervical ansa. And this table can help you to understand how is it with the innervation of the muscles of the neck by cervical plexus and additional fibers from brachial plexus. And finally, phrenic nerve, which is the thickest, longest, and of course the most important of the branches of cervical plexus. It comes from C3 to C5, but majority of the fibers come from C4, and it then descends down as low as diaphragm. Why? The diaphragm is derived from septum transversum, and septum transversum descended from the area which was located cranially to cardiogenic zone. So when then the heart descended down, also the diaphragm has to descend it down, mainly during folding of the embryo during development. And then the diaphragm took the nerve with itself, and the nerve is so long. So the nerve supplies the diaphragm, but it also supplies what is along its course. And so it supplies with sensory fibers the structures which it bypasses, and these are serosal structures. So it's pericardium that runs on the lateral surface of pericardium together with the pericardiacophrenic vessels. It supplies adjacent pleura, so mediastinal pleura. When it comes to diaphragm, so it also supplies the pleura on the diaphragm. And when it pierces the diaphragm, it also supplies parietonal peritoneum covering diaphragm, but it also extends to liver, as the liver and diaphragm are grown together in area nuda, and it extends as low as gallbladder, which is important that in case of inflammation of gallbladder, there can be, not in every case, but there can appear a hiccup, yeah? A cramp of the diaphragm, which then causes a hiccup. Quite interesting information is that we have an accessory fibers which comes from C5. They run together with the subclavian nerve, but then they leave it, run laterally, and join the phrenic nerve at the level of the first rib. So that's the accessory phrenic nerve, and the neurosurgeon has to think about that, not to cut it during the operations, to save the full function of diaphragm. If we cut the spinal cord at the level of C4 or above, the patient cannot breathe without ventilation. If we cut it below, or there's a lesion below, the patient has problems with the movements of all four limbs, so quadriplegia, but he or she can breathe without any help needed. As for the topography, we should remember that the phrenic nerve, where it emerges, it runs and descends on the anterior scalene muscle together with the ascending cervical artery. It is not a neurovascular bundle, but they run in the vicinity to each other, and it's easy then to find these structures together. Then it comes close to subclavian vessels and pass through superior thoracic aperture, or so-called thoracic inlet. Then it goes together with the pericardiacophrenic vessels, and then it pierces diaphragm. The right one in the foramen of vena cava, the left one via the fleshy part of the costal part of diaphragm. So that's for topography. And in case of the palsy, when we have bilateral palsy, of course, the patient is suffocating as there is no breathing. If it's unilateral, then only one wall of the diaphragm is working, so there's a dyspnoea. If it's irritated, we have the jerks, and the jerks symptoms are called hiccup. And hiccup can be a symptom of peritonitis, of the inflammation of peritoneum. It can be a symptom of cholecystitis, so inflammation of gallbladder. It can be even a symptom of cerebral damage. So that's all for cervical plexus. Now let's talk about thoracic spinal nerves. The thoracic spinal nerves, they keep their segmental arrangement. Why? as we have the ribs, then there is no space for muscles to intermingle, so they keep their arrangement as well, the intercostal muscles, so the nerves, they do not form plexuses. We have 11 pairs of intercostal nerves, and the last, below the 12th rib, is then called subcostal. They are mixed nerves, so they are motor and sensory, and we will talk about what they supply just now. So, as for the topography, they run in a neurovascular bundle arranged from superior to inferior vein, artery, and nerve, and they are located in the groove of the rib. So for us, it's important if we would like to perform puncture of the thorax, we perform it in the lower part of the intercostal space at the superior border of the rib. We can see that the nerve or the whole neurovascular bundle is arranged in the deeper layer between the intima and interknee muscles. And the same will be also in the abdominal muscles, as the intercostal nerves, they supply not only thorax, but the lower ones, they also continue in the lateral and anterior abdominal wall. So they will continue also deeper between the second and third layer, so between internal, oblique, and transverse abdominal muscles. So which are the branches? So first, the sensory branches. It has got lateral and anterior sensory branches. Do not forget that we have the posterior cutaneous branch, which is branch from the posterior branch of the spinal nerve, or the skin adjacent to the deep back muscles and the vertebral column dorsally. But then we have the lateral and we have the anterior ones. Yeah, look at the figure, and we see the anterior ones just close to the midline, and the lateral ones, which we see in the approximately anterior axillary line. And we can see that both the anterior and lateral one, that at the level of T4 to T6, they supply the mammary gland. So we call these branches then the lateral and medial mammary branches. Yeah, level T4 to T6, and you may remember that T4 is the dermatome at the nipple, yeah, for orientation. So these are the cutaneous branches, but they also send branches internally to supply the costal pleura. Yeah, so we have the pleural branches, and the inferior ones, which continue to the lateral and anterior abdominal wall, they send also peritoneal branches to supply parietal peritoneum. It's important clinically if we have peritonitis, so irritation of these branches, for example, due to inflammation of vermiform appendix, it can start to irritate the parietal peritoneum, then it starts to cause pain, but also the muscles above that, they get into a cramp, they are in spasm, so they then you feel very tough, very stiff muscles of the abdomen, and it's called in clinics défense musculaire. This French term means a muscle defense, so défense musculaire. And then we should speak about very thin but clinically also important branches, intercostobrachial nerves. They come from T2 or sometimes from T3 as the accessory one, and they cross axilla. They join medial cutaneous nerve of the arm, or medial cutaneous brachial nerve, and they supply the skin of axilla and the medial aspect of the arm. And if we need to remove the lymph nodes in axilla due to the involvement in cancer, the metastatic processes due to the cancer of the breast, we have to avoid cutting these nerves. In case we need to cut them, the patient has to be informed ahead that she can suffer from paresthesia or anesthesia of axilla and medial side or medial aspect of the arm. So please remember these, and I'll show you a figure. And we can nicely see here the intercostobrachial nerves, yeah, as are structures which pass perpendicular to all the other structures of the axilla, mainly to thoracodorsal and along thoracic nerve, which you can see here. Yeah? So they are really the only transverse structure in axilla. Please remember these intercostobrachial nerves. And finally, the intercostal nerve supplies the muscles. And which muscles? We have already talked about the intercostal muscles, so the external, internal, and intimal, plus the rudimentary subcostal muscles in each intercostal space. Then a muscle on the posterior aspect of the sternum, so transverse thoracis. So these are proper thoracic muscles. Then they supply the third layer of the back muscles, the superior and inferior posterior serratus muscles. And then, of course, the muscles of the abdomen, all three groups. So the whole rectus abdominis, the whole external, internal, and transverse abdominis muscle, of course, the rudimentary pyramidalis, and they contribute to innervation of the quadratus lumborum, which is also innervated by L1, L2, L3 spinal nerves. So we can see that they are very important for breathing. And that's all for the anatomy of the intercostal nerves. Here we can see that the intercostobrachial nerves are also important for anesthesia. In case we would like to apply an air tourniquet for the upper limb to operate without bleeding, then it is recommended to apply here a local anesthesia to the intercostobrachial nerves to put the air tourniquet here without any further pain. And of course, we can perform a superficial block of cervical plexus here at the point of Fionage we have talked about before. And is there any policy of the intercostal nerves? Of course, they can be harmed by injuries, but what is more important is the irritation of the nerves. Yeah, so not the palsy, as it is written here, but better irritation. So the irritation can be caused by Herpes Zoster. Herpes Zoster is a virus which can survive in spinal ganglia, and when a patient is mentally or physically a bit affected, then it can be reactivated, and it forms such blisters in the extent of the intercostal nerves. Yeah, it takes some 6 weeks to heal. And of course, we talk about the irritation of the peritoneum by any inflammation which causes the reflective contraction of the abdominal muscles, and it's called the défense musculaire. in abdomen, it is not so easy to examine the reflexes, and the reflexes are not monosynaptic. As you can see, they are polysynaptic and polysegmental mainly. So we can divide them into epigastric, meso, and hypogastric, and they cover usually 2 segments. And the last information, anatomical information, is about the coccygeal plexus, which is the smallest plexus formed by S5 and the coccygeal nerve, which leaves the sacral hiatus. This small plexus is lying on the ischiococcygeal muscle, which is a small muscle in the extent of sacrospinous ligament, and it contributes to the innervation of the ischiococcygiosis and levator ani muscle, but majority of the levator are supplied by pudendal nerve and direct branches from sacral plexus. But it also gives small sensory innervation, and these nerves are called anococcygeal nerve, as they supply what we find between the posterior aspect of anus and the apex of the coccygeal bone, which is palpable. In the case of fracture of coccyx, these nerves can be harmed or entrapped, and it can be very painful. Yeah, so small nerves, but quite interesting. So we are getting to the end, and we have to define also some general terms for neurology. First, we have here the term area nervina. Area nervina means an area of skin supplied by one superficial nerve. You already know these area nervinae of the limbs, yeah, the cutaneous innervation of the limbs here. And it's important in clinics if we have entrapment or a lesion of the nerve, then we understand in which area there is no sensation. But when we have a part of the human body innervated by one spinal nerve, it is different. Then we call it a radicular area, somatosensory radicular area, or by one word, dermatome. Dermatome is not a tumor of the skin. It is the area of skin supplied by one spinal nerve, which comes from one spinal segment. So let's look at such a map. Such map of dermatomes or of somatosensory radicular areas looks like this. And you have to learn to draw it. Why it's important? If we have any lesion in the vertebral canal, there can be a tumor, exostosis, herniated disc, then the disc can compress the spinal nerve, and then we can feel paresthesia or anesthesia, pain in these areas of the human body. If you see such anteflexed or bent person, you can nicely see how the dermatomes form zones or stripes on the human body. But if you stand in normal anatomical position, it is not so easy to imagine. And there are some important points which has to be stressed. Okay, there is no C1 dermatome. Yeah, we have talked about that. At C1, no dermatome. Of course, on the head, we have the areas innervated by trigeminal nerves. It should not be called dermatomes, as trigeminal nerve is not a spinal nerve, but they of course belong to this map. Then you can see here the level between C or the border between C4 and T2. Why there is no C5 to T1? C5 to T1, they traveled to the upper limb. Yeah? They travel to the upper limb, and for example, you can see T1 and C8, they supply the medial aspect of the forearm and hand and the little finger. When we look from dorsally, then the border between C4 and T2, here there's a small area which is supplied by C5, C6, very small area here, C7, C8, T1 are not represented dorsally. Then you should remember T4, nipple, T10, umbilicus, T12, inguinal area. And if you come to the lower limb, you can see that there are again the stripes on the lower limb, and then close to the anus, it forms again such circles or ovals. And here remember that ventrally we have C3 to C4, which is the pudendal nerve here, C3, C4, and C5. Okay, so please learn this, which is very, very important for neurology. Most common herniation appears at the area of L5 or S1, S2. So then you can see where we can find the dermatomes L5, S1, S2. So we find them mainly on the lateral aspect of the lower limb and the posterior aspect as low as the foot. So when I come back to the general terms, we already know what is dermatome, what is area nervina. Of course, we have the visceral radicular area, which is the area of an internal organ supplied by one spinal segment, and we have, of course, motor radicular area, which means a muscle group of muscles or parts of the muscles supplied by one spinal nerve or by one spinal segment. And clinically, again, important is what is known as a head's zone or a reflex zone. As one nerve contains both somatosensory fibers for skin and visceral sensory fibers for organs, they converge, and if the skin fibers are irritated too much, it can cause irritation of the, if any visceral sensory fibers from organs are irritated too much, it can cause, by the close relationship of these fibers, it can cause an irritation of the skin fibers as well. So you can feel a pain in the skin area, which is not caused by irritation of the skin, but it's caused by irritation of the organs. But these informations are finally converging into one spinal nerve. So let's look at the examples. So here you can see the head zones, and for some organs the head zone is quite similar to where we find it. So for example, stomach in the left hypochondrium, liver a bit below the right hypochondrium, but some of them are a bit moved, and these moved are, for example, kidney and testis, which we find in the inguinal area, diaphragm, which we find in the shoulder, and heart, which is shown here very small, but the heart is here, as the fibers supplying the heart comes from T1 to T4, and T1 to T4, don't forget that T1 comes also here, T2, T1, into the left upper limb, and it can even come as low as the little finger. Yeah, so when you have a heart attack, you can feel it as a pain in the thorax, either ventrally or dorsally in the back or in the left upper limb as well. So these are the head zones, and here is a list of organs and the head zones, which should help you to localize the the pain and the irritation of the organ, and vice versa. If the patient feels pain in these areas, you can derive which organ can be irritated. So please pay attention to these head zones. And finally, don't forget what is the motor unit. As I said, a group of muscle fibers supplied by one motor neuron. And the more muscle fibers in one motor unit, the more precise the movement is. So, for example, the external ocular muscles, so the oculomotor muscles, they have very the number of motor units is very high. So thank you very much for your attention, and have a nice day. Goodbye, ladies and gentlemen.